Wilson Keller was the kind of man who exuded confidence, a trait that came naturally after years in the cockpit. At 35, he had traveled to nearly every corner of the globe, his seasoned experience earning him respect among colleagues and passengers alike. His life seemed perfectly structured: routine flights, a steady rhythm of takeoffs and landings, and the occasional brief weekend at home. His personal life, however, was a little less thrilling. Recently divorced, he found solace in the skies, far removed from the complications that awaited him on the ground. Then came Aliana. Aliana Rose, a flight attendant with the effortless grace of someone accustomed to navigating the confined aisles of an airplane, was new on the crew. At 28, she was vivacious, with a spark that caught Wilson's attention from their first flight together. She had a warmth that was undeniable, an easy laugh that softened even the most mundane conversations, and a confident charm that seemed both intriguing and a little dangerous. For Wilson, who had buried his heart under layers of caution and detachment, Aliana was a breath of fresh air. Their connection started innocently enough: small talk in the galley, shared jokes during long-haul flights, and laughter over post-flight dinners with the crew. But as they spent more time together, those moments took on a different weight. They found themselves lingering a little longer, sharing glances that lasted a beat too long, and finding excuses to sit next to each other whenever possible. Wilson, for all his experience and restraint, felt drawn to Aliana like a moth to flame. One evening, after a particularly turbulent flight, Aliana invited Wilson out for a drink. It was a quiet bar, away from the usual noise and clamor, where the lights were dim, and the air was filled with a jazz melody that seemed to wrap around them. They spoke for hours, each sip of whiskey and laughter loosening the guarded layers between them. By the end of the night, they both knew it wasn't just casual companionship anymore. Against his better judgment, Wilson allowed himself to fall into an affair with her, despite knowing the risks, both professional and personal. As the weeks went by, Wilson became deeply entangled in the affair, finding a thrill in their secrecy. Aliana was different. She was passionate, daring, and made him feel alive in ways he hadn't felt in years. He knew he was treading dangerous ground, but he couldn't help himself. The hidden messages, the stolen kisses between flights, and the fleeting moments they shared made him feel as if he had broken free from the confines of his otherwise structured life. But beneath her warmth, Aliana carried secrets of her own, ones she guarded carefully, never letting them slip even in her most vulnerable moments. And Wilson, blinded by his attraction, missed the subtle signs: her evasive answers to questions about her past, the late-night phone calls she would take in hushed tones, the occasional flash of worry that would cross her face when she thought he wasn't looking. Then, one evening as they were sitting in a quiet corner of an airport lounge, Aliana looked at him, her eyes serious, the usual spark replaced by something heavier. She took his hand, a touch that was softer than usual, almost pleading. "Wilson," she started, hesitating as though weighing each word. "I need a favor." He looked at her, surprised. She was always so self-sufficient, the last person he'd expect to ask for help. "Anything," he replied without a second thought, eager to prove his commitment. "There's a package," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A friend of mine needs it transported, and, well, it would be easier if it went through without customs." She quickly added, "It's just some personal items, nothing illegal." "But customs can be difficult." Wilson felt a twinge of unease but dismissed it just as quickly. After all, he trusted her. She had become a significant part of his life, and this small favor seemed like a reasonable way to repay her for the joy she'd brought into his otherwise monotonous routine. "All right," he agreed, though the word felt heavier than it should have. "Just this once." Aliana smiled, a flicker of relief in her eyes, and kissed him softly. "Thank you, Wilson. You don't know what this means to me." The favor seemed innocent enough at first, a simple envelope tucked into his carry-on, far from the prying eyes of airport security. Wilson didn't think much of it, brushing aside any lingering doubts with the reassurance that it was only a one-time thing. Yet, as he carried the envelope through customs without incident, a nagging voice at the back of his mind questioned whether he truly knew Aliana at all. In his hotel room that night, he turned the situation over in his mind, but each time he remembered Aliana's soft plea, her gratitude, and the warmth they shared, he felt his doubts wane. She had brought him back to life in so many ways, pulled him out of his shell, and reignited a spark he thought he had lost. The envelope, he reasoned, was a small price to pay. Weeks after delivering the first package, Wilson tried to bury any residual unease, convincing himself that the favor was a one-time incident. Life with Aliana returned to its usual thrill, stolen moments, whispered promises, and that feeling of secrecy that only fueled his attraction to her. But something had shifted. Occasionally, Wilson would catch Aliana lost in thought, her smile faltering, her laughter a little forced. He wanted to ask her what was wrong, but each time he tried, she would brush it off, diverting the conversation to lighter topics. Then one evening, as they shared a quiet dinner in a restaurant near the airport, Aliana lowered her gaze, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her wine glass. "Wilson, I need another favor," she said softly, almost as if the words weighed on her. Wilson's heart skipped a beat. The memory of the first package returned, and with it, a flicker of doubt he couldn't quite ignore. He tried to keep his voice steady. "Another favor?" "Yes," she replied, her tone pleading. "This time, it's just a bit more than last time, but it's still harmless. Personal items for the same friend. He's moving and doesn't want to deal with the customs hassle." Wilson hesitated. Something felt off. The last package had unsettled him enough, and he had promised himself he wouldn't do it again. But the look in Aliana's eyes, the desperation, the silent plea, it was almost impossible to resist. Against his better judgment, he nodded slowly. "All right, but this is the last time, Aliana. I mean it." She reached across the table, her fingers wrapping around his. "Thank you, Wilson. I knew I could count on you." The second package was heavier, bulkier, a metal case this time. Wilson's gut twisted as he tucked it into his luggage, his instincts warning him that he was stepping deeper into something he didn't understand. He told himself that Aliana wouldn't lead him into anything truly dangerous, that this was just another harmless favor. But the unease gnawed at him as he boarded his flight. As they touched down and Wilson went through customs, he felt the weight of the case more acutely. Every glance from the officers, every idle conversation with a passerby, heightened his anxiety. He moved through the terminal, avoiding eye contact, hands clammy with the growing sense of dread. Finally alone in his hotel room, Wilson placed the case on the bed, staring at it as though it might come alive. He considered opening it, just to reassure himself, but he feared what he might find. Instead, he took a deep breath, telling himself that it was over, that he would deliver it to Aliana's friend and never get involved again. The next morning, as he was preparing to leave, a message appeared on his phone, a single, anonymous text. "You're in over your head, Wilson. Stop now, or you'll regret it." He felt a chill creep down his spine. Someone knew about the packages, about him, about Aliana. His hands trembled as he reread the message, trying to make sense of it. Had someone been watching him? Did Aliana know about this? He confronted Aliana that night, the message still fresh in his mind, his tone edged with fear. "I got a message, Aliana. Someone knows about what I've been doing for you. About the packages." Her expression darkened, but she remained calm, almost too calm. Wilson, it's nothing to worry about. People try to intimidate us all the time. It's part of the business. The business, he echoed, suspicion thick in his voice. What kind of a business are you involved in, Aliana? She hesitated, her gaze hardening, the vulnerability he'd seen earlier replaced by a cold resolve. Wilson, you've seen too much to back out now. I didn't want to drag you into this, but I had no choice. You've helped me, and if you want to stay safe, you need to stay with me. Wilson's heart pounded. He had been so blinded by his feelings for her, by the thrill of their affair, that he had ignored every warning sign. Now, he was in too deep. Her words hinted at danger far beyond what he'd imagined. What happens if I stop? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the true depth of her fear. They won't let you, Wilson. They'll come for you, and for me. We're both in this now. We just need to finish one more delivery, and we'll be safe. I promise. Despite the growing sense of betrayal, despite his mind screaming at him to walk away, Wilson found himself nodding. One more delivery. He would do this one last thing, and then he would break free of whatever Aliana had entangled him in. But doubt lingered in his mind. Could he really trust her? The woman he thought he knew now seemed like a stranger, her once warm smile veiled by shadows he hadn't seen before. As he walked back to his hotel room, every step felt heavier, as if the ground itself were pulling him down into a trap he couldn't escape. Days later, Wilson received instructions for the next delivery. This time, the package was larger, and he was given explicit directions on where to take it. The anonymous messages continued, each one more threatening than the last. Someone was watching his every move, and he felt like prey caught in an invisible web, unable to move without being observed. Yet, despite the looming threat, he found himself preparing for the final delivery, hoping that Aliana's promises of safety would prove true. But deep down, he knew, this wasn't just about Aliana anymore. He had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and he was no longer sure if he could trust anyone. As he boarded the next flight, the package tucked securely in his bag, he felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding. The world around him seemed sharper, colder, as though every sound and shadow hid unseen dangers. He kept a careful eye on the passengers, the crew, and even the airport staff, suspecting that any one of them could be watching him. It was no longer just a game of cat and mouse. For Wilson, it was survival. And as he took his seat, preparing himself for the final task that would supposedly set him free, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was racing towards something dark and inescapable, something that had been lying in wait for him since the moment he fell for Aliana's charms. Wilson's nerves frayed with each passing day. The flight carrying what he believed would be his final task had left him feeling watched, as if unseen eyes lurked in every corner. The threatening messages had become relentless, gnawing at his sense of security. Everywhere he went, he scanned his surroundings, noticing every shadow, every unfamiliar face. Yet Aliana had assured him that once he completed this last delivery, they would be safe, and their lives would return to some semblance of normalcy. He wanted to believe her, he had to. But that belief shattered the evening he followed her. Wilson had grown increasingly suspicious, noticing Aliana's tense demeanor, the way she would take phone calls only in private, and how she'd grown distant from him. Determined to get answers, he trailed her after their flight landed, keeping a safe distance as she made her way through the crowded terminal. She moved purposefully, a look of cold determination replacing the warmth he had once loved. Aliana exited through a side door and slipped into a narrow alleyway just outside the airport, glancing over her shoulder as if ensuring she hadn't been followed. Wilson hid in the shadows, watching as she met with a man he didn't recognize, a tall figure with a dark coat and an expression as hard as stone. They spoke in hushed tones, but Wilson couldn't make out their words. The man gestured sharply, his expression growing colder with each word, while Aliana nodded, looking almost submissive, her usual confidence noticeably absent. A wave of betrayal washed over Wilson. He had trusted her, had risked everything for her, only to realize he was just a pawn in a game far bigger than he'd anticipated. The man handed Aliana a package, and she slipped it into her bag, casting a quick glance down the alleyway. Wilson froze, realizing he was dangerously close to being spotted. He turned away, pressing himself against the wall, his heart pounding as he heard her footsteps fade into the distance. That night, he confronted her, unable to keep his anger contained any longer. "Who was that man, Aliana?" he demanded, his voice barely masking his rage. Aliana flinched, caught off guard by his tone. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape. "Wilson, it's not what you think." "Not what I think," he shot back, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me, haven't you? This whole time, I thought I was helping you. But I was just a fool, your little puppet." She took a deep breath, her expression shifting from guilt to steely resolve. "Wilson, I didn't want it to be this way. But you don't understand. Once you're in, there's no way out. These people, they don't forgive mistakes. So what was I to you, then?" His voice cracked, anger mingling with hurt. "A convenient cover? Someone to take the fall?" Her silence was all the answer he needed. The woman he had once adored, the one who had filled his life with laughter and passion, was gone, replaced by a stranger he could hardly recognize. "Wilson, listen," she began, her tone urgent. "You have to trust me. They won't let either of us go if we don't finish this. Just one more job, and we'll be free." Wilson shook his head, bitter laughter escaping his lips. "Free? Aliana, don't lie to me again. I know they're coming for me. I'm getting messages, threats. My life's already ruined because of you." Aliana's face softened, and for a brief moment, Wilson saw a flicker of genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Wilson. I never meant for you to get hurt. I thought maybe we could find a way out together." Her words rang hollow, and Wilson realized then that he had no choice. If he stayed, he would remain trapped in this web of lies and deceit, his life hanging by a thread in a world he didn't understand. But running wasn't an option either. Aliana had made it clear that the people she worked for would never let them go. Desperation clawed at him. He was out of options, his trust shattered, and his life teetering on the edge of ruin. There was only one thing left to do: confront the very people who had manipulated him. The next day, Wilson went to the airport prepared to deliver the final package. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, anger, and a sense of betrayal so deep it left him numb. He walked through the terminal with the package tucked securely in his bag, moving with the careful, robotic precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. But as he reached the designated handoff point, a secluded area near the back entrance, he realized something was wrong. The area was too quiet, the usual hum of airport staff and passengers conspicuously absent. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to abandon the package and flee, but it was too late. 3 men appeared, emerging from the shadows with an air of calculated menace. Wilson recognized one of them as the man he had seen with Aliana. The man smirked, his eyes glinting with a cold satisfaction. "Wilson Keller," he said, his voice smooth yet dripping with malice. "We've heard so much about you." Wilson forced himself to stay calm, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Where's Aliana?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound steady. The man laughed, a low, sinister sound. "Oh, don't worry about Aliana. She played her part well. Too well, in fact. But you were always expendable." A surge of anger and betrayal coursed through Wilson, and he clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "I trusted her," he hissed. "I did everything you people asked, and this is what I get?" "Trust is a dangerous thing, Mr. Keller," the man replied, his voice devoid of empathy. "It makes people like you vulnerable. And people like us, we take advantage of that." Before Wilson could react, two of the men grabbed him, pinning his arms as he struggled. Panic set in as he realized the gravity of his situation. There would be no escape, no last-minute rescue. He had been a pawn all along, and now he was about to pay the ultimate price. As they forced him to his knees, Wilson's thoughts drifted to the life he had once led, the stability, the respect, the safety he had taken for granted. And then, Aliana's face flashed before him, a final, bitter reminder of how easily he had been deceived. The last thing he heard was the man's cold, indifferent voice. "Goodbye, Mr. Keller. Consider this your final flight." The news of Wilson's death reached Aliana the following morning. She had suspected it would happen eventually, the organization didn't leave loose ends. But she hadn't expected the surge of guilt that tore through her when she learned the cold details of his final moments. He was gone, and with him, the last sliver of warmth that had lingered in her hollow life. For all her calculated actions, all her betrayals, Wilson had been the only person to see beyond her facade. And now, she had cost him his life. The next few days passed in a fog. Aliana went through the motions, her mind replaying every decision she had made, each one compounding the weight pressing on her chest. She tried to silence the memories, the ghostly reminders of Wilson's laugh, his trustful gaze, the small, fleeting moments they'd shared. But they clung to her, more persistent and accusing with every passing hour. She could leave. That was the easiest path, the one the organization would advise her to take. They would help her disappear, erase any connections she had to Wilson, to her past life, to anyone who might have remembered her face. Yet the thought of running, of moving on without making amends, left her feeling hollow, as if all she would ever be was a shell, a haunting echo of her own choices. Instead, she went to the authorities. At the police station, Aliana felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. She knew the organization's reach. If they found out she had betrayed them, they would come after her without hesitation. But as she sat across from the lead investigator, a grizzled man with an air of skepticism, she found herself resolute. The detective leaned back, arms crossed, studying her with a critical eye. "So you want to talk," he said, his tone laced with doubt. "Why now? After all you've done?" "Because someone died because of me," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I can't live with that." For hours, Aliana recounted everything, how she had become entangled in the organization, how they had used her position as a flight attendant to move illicit goods under the guise of personal favors, and how she had convinced Wilson to participate without his knowledge. She held nothing back, detailing the group's methods, their routes, and their network of contacts. She watched as the detective's expression shifted from skepticism to focused attention, sensing that her story was deeper and darker than he had anticipated. By the time she finished, she felt drained, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her confession had physically pressed down on her. The detective nodded slowly, setting his notepad aside. "Your information is valuable," he admitted, "but you understand what this means. You're making powerful enemies." Aliana met his gaze, the fear in her eyes clear but tempered with determination. "I understand. But if this helps bring them down, if it brings justice for Wilson, then it's worth it." The days that followed were a blur of interrogations, questions, and witness statements as Aliana provided every scrap of information she had. She was moved to a safe house, her location known only to a few officers within the department, as they worked tirelessly to piece together the syndicate's operations. Aliana found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, haunted by the knowledge that the organization would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. Despite the lingering fear, she felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, she wasn't hiding behind lies or manipulating others to save herself. She was standing in the open, willing to pay the price for her actions, knowing that this was the only way she could honor Wilson's memory. Her betrayal of him would forever stain her conscience, but perhaps, in exposing the truth, she could give his death some meaning. One evening, as she sat in the dimly lit safe house, her phone rang. The detective was on the line, his tone brisk and urgent. "We've made some arrests," he informed her. "A few high-ranking members of the group are in custody. They're starting to talk." Relief washed over her, tempered with a sense of unfinished business. She thanked him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Every arrest, every confession, brought them one step closer to dismantling the network that had cost so many lives, including Wilson's. But the danger was far from over. One evening, as she returned to her safe house, she noticed the flicker of a shadow moving near her door. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she forced herself to remain calm, her hand hovering over the phone to call for backup. The detective had warned her that the organization might retaliate if they discovered her cooperation, and now, it seemed, her fears were coming to fruition. Before she could react, the door opened, and a figure stepped inside, a man with a face she recognized all too well. He was one of the organization's enforcers, a man known for handling problems like her with ruthless efficiency. "You thought you could betray us and walk away?" he sneered, stepping closer, his eyes cold and predatory. Aliana swallowed, her mind racing as she tried to keep her composure. "You can kill me if you want," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "But it won't stop the investigation. They know everything." The man's gaze hardened, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "You were a fool, Aliana. You could have walked away. And let more people like Wilson die," she shot back, her voice trembling with anger and grief. "I won't be part of this anymore. I'd rather die." The man's expression twisted with contempt, but before he could make a move, the sound of sirens pierced the air outside. Aliana felt a surge of relief, knowing the detective had arranged surveillance around the safe house. As the police stormed in, the man tried to flee, but he was quickly apprehended, his threats falling silent as he was led away in cuffs. In the aftermath, Aliana sat with the detective, her hands shaking, her face pale but resolved. The network was falling apart, and though she knew it would take time for the full extent of their influence to be dismantled, she had done her part. She had avenged Wilson in the only way she knew, by exposing the darkness that had consumed them both. Months later, as the case drew to a close, Aliana visited Wilson's grave. She stood in silence, the cool wind brushing against her face as she placed a single white rose on the headstone. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have told you the truth. You deserved better." For the first time since his death, she felt a sense of closure. Her guilt would never fully fade, but she had found a way to make amends, to give his death meaning in a world that had stolen so much from him. She turned away, walking into the distance with a heavy heart, yet carrying the faint hope that she could, perhaps, find peace once more.